Welcome back. You who sit in storms wrapped in quiet, observing the chaos around you without being pulled into it. You who remain composed while everything else rushes to react. You who notice patterns not because you are searching for power, but because you have learned that attention is a form of survival. Something happened, didn't it? Something subtle at first, something small enough to be dismissed, but precise enough to matter. Something they never imagined would carry weight. Something that turned their carefully polished plan into uncertainty under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. In rooms where people like to believe truth is procedural, controllable, and safe. And you sat there, calm and collected, watching it unfold, while their lawyer, the one they paid extensively to anticipate every angle and manage every risk, held a piece of paper that made his hands falter just slightly. Not enough for others to notice, but enough for you to see. Their legal team had spent months constructing a narrative, arranging facts selectively, building a version of events designed to make sense only if no one questioned it too closely. Experts were brought in to analyze your actions, to frame your responses, to present you as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be understood. The story was polished, rehearsed, and presented with confidence. And then, in a single moment, a single message from 2 years earlier quietly unraveled it. You were not scheming when you sent that message. You were not anticipating courtrooms or cross-examinations. You were not preparing evidence. You were simply documenting your reality, speaking honestly to someone you trusted, writing things down because you needed clarity, not leverage. And now, that message has become a reference point, a timestamp that anchors your account in time, not as an attack, but as a record, not as a strategy, but as context. And suddenly, what they spent months constructing no longer stands on stable ground. That message, sent late at night, casual and unpolished, laid out the sequence of events as you understood them at the time. It described behaviors, tactics, and likely outcomes based on what you had already experienced. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was observational. And what unsettled them was not that you accused anyone, but that your words aligned so closely with what later unfolded. They believed they were building a case, moving deliberately and strategically. You were simply paying attention. What they struggled to understand is that you were not predicting the future. You were recognizing patterns. You had lived through similar situations before, seen the same behaviors repeat themselves under different names and faces. You knew the language, the timing, the sequence. You understood how narratives are constructed when accountability is avoided. You were familiar with how responsibility is shifted, how stories are reframed, how confusion is introduced deliberately. So when you wrote that message, you were not guessing. You were describing what you had already learned through experience. When the lawyer looked at that paper, something shifted. Not because he was unprepared, but because preparation has limits when faced with consistency. He wasn't just confronting a document. He was confronting a record that predated the dispute itself. A record that existed before any formal claims were made. A record that showed your understanding had not evolved conveniently over time, but had been present from the beginning. You did not need legal training to do this. You did not need inside knowledge. You needed only the patience to observe and the discipline to write things down honestly. The courtroom, silent as it was, bore witness to something simple but difficult to dismiss. Your message and their defense followed the same structure, the same sequence, the same shifts in tone and responsibility. It was not that you had access to their strategy, it was that their strategy followed a pattern you already recognized. They expected arguments. They expected disputes over interpretation. Instead, they encountered clarity. If you go back to that night 2 years earlier, you were not thinking about outcomes. You were tired. Tired of repetition. Tired of the same behaviors resurfacing in different forms. You had seen this pattern before, and you wrote because you needed to ground yourself in reality. You needed to confirm that what you were seeing was real, that it followed logic, that it made sense. You wrote not to convince others, but to reassure yourself that your understanding was intact. That message was measured. It was careful. It did not exaggerate. It did not assign motives recklessly. It identified actions and anticipated responses based on past experience. You noted what had already happened and what was likely to follow if the pattern continued. You were not angry when you wrote it. You were focused. And that focus became your protection later, even though you had no intention of using it that way at the time. People who endure repeated challenges develop a heightened awareness, not by choice, but by necessity. They learn to notice what others overlook. They pay attention to pauses, to shifts in language, to changes in behavior that signal something underneath the surface. This does not make them controlling or suspicious. It makes them attentive. Experience teaches lessons that theory cannot. And over time, those lessons form a framework for understanding situations as they unfold. 2 years later, that framework proved accurate. While their team assembled arguments and timelines, your earlier observations stood unchanged. One note, one timestamp, one consistent account. You did not expose anything dramatically. You simply placed reality next to representation and allowed the difference to be seen. There was no need for humiliation. There was no need for exaggeration. The contrast spoke for itself. You did not claim to be infallible. You did not claim certainty beyond what you observed. You documented what you saw and how similar situations had progressed before. When their actions aligned with that record, it became difficult to dismiss. Your documentation did not prove intent. It demonstrated consistency, and consistency, when recorded honestly, carries weight. There is a language to manipulation that is rarely taught openly. It has rhythms and patterns, predictable shifts from denial to deflection, from deflection to projection, from projection to victimhood. You recognize those patterns because you had encountered them before. You did not invent them. You did not exaggerate them. You simply recognized their structure and wrote it down. As the process unfolded, attempts to mischaracterize or isolate you lost their effectiveness. Not because you overpowered anyone, but because clarity leaves little room for confusion. You remained patient. You remained accurate. You allowed your record to speak without adding to it unnecessarily. And in doing so, you preserved your credibility. You did not emerge from this as someone seeking recognition or dominance. You emerged as someone whose account remained steady over time, someone whose understanding did not shift conveniently with circumstance, someone who paid attention early and trusted that attention enough to document it. The question that keeps being asked, "How did you know?" has a simple answer. You paid attention. You learned from experience. You wrote things down honestly when they happened. You did not rely on hindsight to create coherence. You created clarity in real time, even when you did not yet know why it would matter. And that is where the story truly rests. Not in triumph, not in spectacle, but in the quiet discipline of observation, documentation, and patience. You did not seek power. You sought understanding. And that understanding, recorded faithfully, became enough. As the days passed and the situation continued to unfold, you noticed how people's actions often mirrored the same patterns you had observed before. This was not because you were predicting the future, but because human behavior often repeats itself in recognizable ways. People react to pressure, fear, and opportunity according to habits, tendencies, and learned defenses. You had seen this many times before in different contexts, with different faces, and so you understood that what seemed unpredictable to others was often entirely predictable if one observed carefully and recorded events with honesty. You were neither extraordinary nor infallible. You were attentive. You noticed when words did not align with actions, when excuses repeated themselves, when responsibility was shifted subtly to evade accountability. And when you recorded these observations, you did not do so to manipulate or control outcomes. You did so to ensure clarity for yourself, to preserve your own understanding, and to protect your integrity. This attention to detail became increasingly valuable as time went on. Every action they took, every argument they presented, every attempt to reframe the narrative, could be traced against your earlier notes. The contrast was unmistakable, not because you had orchestrated it, but because reality followed the patterns you had seen before and documented accurately. You did not rejoice in their confusion or failure. Rather, you appreciated that the truth was evident and that your diligence had created a record that allowed clarity to emerge. The discipline of documentation, of observing without being swept up in emotion, had become a form of quiet strength. It demonstrated that consistency, patience, and honesty could withstand the pressures of deceit, manipulation, and strategy. In reflecting on the months and years leading up to this moment, you realized that your own growth had been shaped by these challenges. Every interaction, every confrontation, every moment where you were undermined or misrepresented had taught you lessons about human behavior, about patience, and about the importance of careful observation. You learned that patience does not mean passivity, that clarity does not require confrontation, and that integrity is most powerful when maintained quietly and consistently. There was a subtle but profound difference between reacting to events impulsively and responding thoughtfully, and the cumulative effect of your careful responses had become evident in the unfolding of this situation. You also came to recognize the value of restraint. It would have been easy to respond with anger, to seek revenge, or to attempt to dominate the narrative for personal satisfaction. Instead, you chose a different path. You documented, you observed, and you allowed the record to speak for itself. This was not weakness, nor was it avoidance. It was a conscious choice to act in a way that preserved your dignity and ensured that your perspective would be represented accurately when needed. By refraining from impulsive reactions, you maintained control over your own actions, while also allowing the truth to emerge in its own time. This approach aligned with the principle that justice is best served through clarity, patience, and integrity, rather than through personal vengeance or malice. The clarity you had cultivated through observation and documentation also allowed you to see others more clearly. You recognized when people were acting out of fear, when they were protecting themselves, and when they were attempting to manipulate situations. This awareness did not make you cynical, it made you careful. You learned to differentiate between deliberate deception and human error, between miscommunication and manipulation. This discernment allowed you to interact with others in a measured, principled way, and it enabled you to respond to challenges without being drawn into unnecessary conflict. Over time, you realized that understanding human behavior was not about controlling others, but about protecting yourself and maintaining your own integrity in the face of complexity. As the legal proceedings continued, you observed that the truth, when documented faithfully, holds weight even in the most complex situations. Evidence that is consistent, verifiable, and clearly presented is difficult to dispute. Your early observations became more than notes. They became a source of credibility, demonstrating that what you had recorded was accurate and that your perspective had been grounded in reality from the start. You did not need to embellish, exaggerate, or manipulate events to make your case. You simply relied on careful attention, methodical recording, and the patience to wait until the right moment for clarity to emerge. This approach, rooted in integrity, ensured that your perspective could withstand scrutiny and could support accountability without relying on emotion or spectacle. It also became clear to you that human behavior is often predictable because it is guided by the same motivations, fears, and tendencies that have existed for centuries. People attempt to protect themselves, to shift responsibility, and to construct narratives that favor their position. Recognizing this is not a matter of arrogance. It is a matter of observation and experience. By documenting patterns rather than outcomes, by recording behavior rather than speculation, you created a record that could withstand manipulation. This record was not a weapon for personal triumph, but a tool for clarity, accountability, and protection. It demonstrated the value of observing without interference, of understanding without judgment, and of maintaining integrity under pressure. In the process of reflection, you also recognize the importance of intention. Every decision to document, every careful note, and every observation was guided by the intention to preserve truth and protect integrity, rather than to dominate or humiliate. In Islam, intention is a fundamental measure of the value of actions. Actions that might appear similar outwardly can carry vastly different weight depending on the purpose behind them. Your discipline in recording events was therefore not just practical, it was ethical. It was guided by a principle that aligns with the understanding that accountability, patience, and integrity are virtues that transcend circumstance. Over time, the impact of your careful attention and documentation became evident, not only to you but also to others. People began to notice consistency, credibility, and clarity in your record. The observations you had made, the sequences you had documented, and the patterns you had recognized all converged to create a perspective that could not easily be challenged. Yet, despite this, you maintained humility. You did not claim foresight beyond what was reasonable, nor did you suggest that your perspective alone dictated outcomes. You recognized that truth emerges from consistency, clarity, and patience, not from ego or dominance. This recognition allowed you to approach the situation with balance, maintaining your integrity while ensuring that the record remained useful and accurate. Through this process, you also learned about the subtle power of patience. Patience does not mean inaction. It means careful attention, measured response, and the willingness to let clarity emerge in its own time. By remaining patient, you allowed the record you created to reveal the truth without forcing outcomes. You allowed others to see the patterns for themselves, to recognize inconsistencies, and to understand that what had been recorded was accurate. Patience became not a passive state, but an active discipline, a way of preserving integrity while navigating complexity. It demonstrated that power is not always loud or visible, but that careful observation and consistent action can be more effective than immediate reaction. Another lesson you carried from this experience was the importance of self-restraint. When confronted with manipulation, deceit, or attempts to misrepresent you, the natural reaction might have been anger, frustration, or a desire to retaliate. Yet you chose restraint. You documented, observed, and maintained composure. This self-restraint preserved your credibility and ensured that your actions were guided by principle rather than emotion. It also reinforced a central truth, that clarity and integrity have their own weight, even when others seek to create confusion. Consistent documentation and principled observation allow truth to prevail in its own time. This understanding became a source of quiet confidence, not arrogance, rooted in the knowledge that integrity endures where manipulation cannot. By now, you also began to appreciate how careful observation extends beyond any single situation. The skills you cultivated, attention to detail, awareness of patterns, and the ability to record events accurately, were not limited to this case. They became tools for life, applicable to relationships, work, and personal growth. Observing without interference, documenting without bias, and remaining patient in the face of uncertainty are skills that preserve clarity in all aspects of life. They demonstrate that strength lies not in dominating others, but in maintaining integrity and understanding the rhythms of human behavior. The more you reflected, the more you realized that your actions had an unintended benefit. They allowed you to see your own growth. By paying attention, documenting faithfully, and maintaining patience, you cultivated skills that strengthened your resilience. You became more aware of your own responses, more deliberate in your actions, and more capable of preserving your principles under pressure. These are qualities that no external challenge can take away because they reside within the discipline you have practiced and the clarity you have maintained. And so the lessons of this experience were manifold. They included the value of observation, the necessity of documentation, the power of patience, and the importance of intention. They included the recognition that human behavior follows patterns, that clarity emerges from consistency, and that integrity is preserved through careful, principled action. Above all, they included the understanding that true strength does not come from controlling outcomes, humiliating others, or asserting dominance, but from maintaining clarity, honesty, and patience in all circumstances. As the situation continued to unfold, you noticed that not only had your early observations been validated, but the process itself taught a profound lesson about the value of calm and deliberate action. When people are caught in their own designs, when they attempt to manipulate situations or control narratives, the natural tendency for most is to react emotionally, to defend themselves aggressively, or to attempt to reclaim control. You, however, had practiced a different approach. By observing quietly, documenting clearly, and remaining patient, you allowed the truth to surface without interference. In doing so, you not only protected yourself, but you also demonstrated the power of integrity and careful attention. Integrity, you realized, is strongest when it is silent yet unshakable. Over time, you also recognized how patience and observation build credibility that no amount of argument or persuasion can match. Credibility does not come from insisting on being right or from silencing opposing views. Credibility comes from consistency, honesty, and clarity. Your record, created long before the stakes were apparent, served as a benchmark that could withstand scrutiny. It was not your words that held weight alone, but the disciplined manner in which you had documented reality.